The land did not care. It stretched out under a white, pitiless sun, a canvas of baked earth and brittle grass that ran until it met a sky so vast and empty it could swallow a man's soul whole. This was a place of distance and indifference, where mountains serrated the horizon like broken teeth, and the wind whispered of loneliness, of survival, of endings. It was into this silence that the stagecoach crawled, a beetle of splintering wood and worn leather, churning a cloud of amber dust that hung in the still air long after it passed. Inside, Alara felt every jolt and sway in her bones. She kept her eyes fixed on the cracked leather of the seat in front of her, her hands clutching a small carpet bag so tightly her knuckles were bloodless. The bag held everything she had left in the world, a change of clothes, her mother's silver locket, and a small, worn Bible she had not opened in months. God, it seemed, had turned his face from the places she had been. She could still feel the heat of the flames on her skin, still smell the metallic tang of blood and the greasy smoke of burning pine. She could still hear the silence that came after the screaming stopped, a silence deeper and more terrible than the one that now pressed in on the stagecoach from all sides. That night had burned away her life, leaving only a single, scorched survivor. The story had traveled faster than she had, carried on the wind like a foul seed. In the last town, they had called her the Calamity Girl, the woman who brought ruin. They said she was cursed, a walking omen of bad luck, and their fear had been a wall she could not breach. So she had boarded another stage, pushing west, chasing a horizon that promised nothing but more of itself, more emptiness. A final, jarring lurch of the coach threw her forward. She looked up, out the dusty window. Redemption Creek. It was not a creek and offered no redemption. It was a single, dusty street lined with a dozen or so grim, false-fronted buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of the sun. A saloon, a general store, a sheriff's office, a livery stable, and a church whose steeple seemed to be pleading with the empty sky. It was a place to stop, but not a place to live. For Alara, that was enough. The driver, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-cracked leather, grunted as he threw her bag down into the dust. End of the line, miss. He did not meet her eyes. No one ever did anymore. Alara stepped down, her legs stiff, her worn boots sinking into the fine, powdery dirt of the main street. The air was thick with the smell of dust, horse manure, and something acrid from the blacksmith's forge at the far end of the road. People stopped what they were doing to watch her. A woman sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store paused, her broom held aloft. Two men leaning against a post outside the saloon fell silent, their eyes following her every move. She felt their stares like physical things, heavy and sharp. They knew who she was. The news had gotten here first. She was a ghost walking in the daylight, a story they would tell their children at night. Her first few hours in town confirmed her isolation. The boarding house was full. The woman at the general store sold her a sack of flour and some coffee with a pursed-lipped reluctance, counting the coins as if they might be tainted. Alara did not ask for help. She had learned long ago not to expect it. She asked instead if there was any place to rent, a cabin, anything. The woman, Mrs. Gable, finally looked at her directly, her eyes small and hard. There's the old Miller place, edge of town. No one's lived in it for years. She did not add that the Miller family had died of fever 2 winters back, but the information hung in the air between them. Another place touched by death. It was fitting. The cabin was worse than she could have imagined. It was a small, lopsided structure of sun-bleached, weathered planks, leaning as if tired of standing. The roof was a patchwork of sod and hope, with visible gaps that promised a wet misery in the first rain. The wind, which had been a constant whisper on the plains, was a mournful moan as it slipped through the cracks in the walls. But it had 4 walls and a door that could be barred. It was a place to hide. It stood apart from the town, just as she did, a symbol of her exile made real in wood and dirt. She paid the meager rent to the sheriff, a man with a tired face and a drooping mustache who seemed to be the town's designated landlord for forgotten properties. He took her money without a word of welcome. She spent the afternoon trying to make the place habitable, sweeping away layers of dust and chasing out a family of mice. It was lonely, exhausting work. As the sun began to dip toward the jagged mountains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, she stepped outside to catch her breath. The air was cooling, and the sky was turning a bruised purple and orange. It was from there, standing in the doorway of her ruin, that she first saw him. The sound came first, a steady, rhythmic ringing of a hammer striking steel. It was a powerful, purposeful sound in the growing quiet of the evening. Her eyes followed it down the dusty street to the smithy, a wide, open-fronted structure that glowed from within like the mouth of a furnace. A man stood silhouetted against the firelight of the forge, his arm rising and falling with an unwavering cadence, beating a glowing piece of iron into submission on the anvil. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder and deep in the chest. His sleeves were rolled up high, revealing forearms corded with muscle that tightened with each powerful swing. Even from a distance, she could see the focused intensity in his posture, the deliberate economy of his movements. There was no wasted energy, only a profound connection between the man, the hammer, and the incandescent steel. As she watched, 2 other men came to collect a repaired wagon wheel. They paid him, their words too distant for her to hear, but their actions were plain. They kept a careful distance. Their posture was stiff, their glances brief and dismissive. They took what they needed from him, their grudging reliance on his skill warring with an obvious and deep-seated contempt. When they turned their backs on him, one of them spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust near the smithy's entrance. The blacksmith did not react. He simply turned back to his forge, his work the only answer he ever gave. Ilara had heard the whispers about him while in the general store. The blacksmith, Kale. They said his father was a white trapper who had long since vanished, and his mother was Pawnee. In a town like Redemption Creek, such a thing marked a man as surely as a brand on a steer. He belonged nowhere. He was a man of 2 worlds and a citizen of none, useful for his hands but welcome for nothing else. As if he could feel her gaze, he stopped his hammering. The sudden silence was jarring. He set the hammer down and turned, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. His face was shadowed, but she could see the hard lines of his jaw, the dark intensity of his eyes as they scanned the street. For a long, breathless moment, his gaze settled on her, a small figure standing alone in the twilight at the edge of town. Their eyes met across the 50 yards of dust and deepening shadow. It was not a look of pity or curiosity. It was something else, a flicker of silent, stark recognition. He was seeing her, not as the cursed girl, the sole survivor, but as something familiar, another soul living on the margins, a fellow exile. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement so small she might have imagined it. Before she could respond, he turned back to the fire, and the rhythmic clang of the hammer resumed, striking sparks into the gathering dark. Ilara retreated into her cabin. The image of his solitary strength burned into her mind. The next day, the sky turned ugly. The brilliant, merciless blue was slowly leached away, replaced by a sickly, brownish-yellow haze that clung to the horizon. The wind, usually a restless wanderer, fell into an unnerving stillness. An old-timer in town spat in the dust and muttered a single word to his companion, "Norther." By midday, the world outside Ilara's cabin had vanished. The dust storm hit not as a gradual assault, but as a solid, roaring wall of grit and fury. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the flimsy cabin, rattling the door in its frame, and finding every crack and hole to whistle through. A fine, gritty silt began to coat every surface inside. The light faded to a dim, suffocating twilight, and the air grew thick and hard to breathe. Ilara wedged her small trunk against the door and stuffed rags into the larger gaps in the walls. But it was a futile effort against the storm's relentless power. She could hear the roof groaning above her, the sod and old planks straining against the assault. A shower of dirt and dried grass rained down on her head. She looked up and saw a new crack of daylight slice across the ceiling. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She scrambled to move her meager belongings, the sack of flour, her bag, the small stack of kindling, to the one corner that seemed relatively safe. She was dragging her mother's old rocking chair when a loud crack, like a rifle shot, echoed overhead. A section of the roof directly above her gave way. She had no time to scream, only to throw herself sideways. A heavy, rough-hewn beam, rotten with age, crashed down where she had been standing an instant before. It landed with a sickening thud, one end smashing the floorboards, the other catching her leg and pinning her to the ground. A wave of white-hot pain shot up from her ankle to her hip. She cried out, the sound swallowed by the storm's roar. Dust and debris rained down on her, clogging her nose and mouth. She was trapped, pinned. The weight was immense, a dead, crushing pressure on her lower leg. She clawed at the beam, her fingers scraping uselessly against the splintered wood. Tears of pain and frustration streamed down her face, carving muddy tracks through the grime. The thought that flashed through her mind was absurdly, cruelly clear. Of course, this is how it happens. The curse was not just a name people called her, it was a living thing, and it had followed her here. Through the shrieking wind and the choking dust, a shape materialized in the ruined doorway. It was a large, dark form, a man who seemed to have stepped directly out of the storm itself. For a heart-stopping second, she thought he was a phantom, an apparition of the wind, but then he moved, his step solid and sure, and she recognized the broad-shouldered silhouette of the blacksmith, Cale. He did not speak. He did not need to. His eyes, dark and assessing, took in the scene in an instant, the collapsed roof, the heavy beam, her trapped form on the floor. He moved with that same focused deliberation she had seen at the forge. He knelt, his large frame shielding her from the worst of the wind howling through the new hole in the roof. He placed his hands on the beam, testing its weight, finding his purchase. His face was a mask of concentration. Then he lifted, his back straightened, the muscles in his arms and shoulders bunching into knots of solid power. The beam groaned in protest as he raised it, inch by agonizing inch, from her leg. Ilara gasped as the pressure eased, the sharp, grinding pain replaced by a throbbing, fiery ache. He strained, his jaw tight, a low grunt escaping his lips from the sheer effort, with a final, mighty heave. He shifted the beam to the side, where it fell to the floor with a heavy crash. He immediately knelt beside her, his presence a solid, calming anchor in the chaotic swirl of the storm. Dust and sweat had carved rivulets on his face, and his dark hair was matted with grit. His eyes, however, were clear and sharp as he looked at her leg. "Can you move it?" His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together, but it held no alarm, only a quiet command. Ilara tried to draw her leg back, but a fresh bolt of pain made her hiss and fall back. He saw her grimace and held up a hand, a silent order to stop. "Let me see." His hands, she noticed, were huge and calloused, stained with soot and marked with the small white scars of his trade. They looked as if they could bend iron and shape steel with their brute force. But when he touched her, his grasp was impossibly gentle. His fingers probed carefully along her shin and ankle, his touch surprisingly careful, searching for the source of the damage with an almost clinical precision. She flinched when he found the spot just above her ankle, a knot of exquisite agony. "It is not broken," he said, his gaze meeting hers, "but badly sprained. You will not be walking on it for a few days." He spoke the words as a simple statement of fact. He stood then, and for a moment, she thought he would leave. Instead, he looked around the ruined cabin, his eyes lingering on the gaping hole in the roof. He took off the thick canvas coat he wore and draped it over her shoulders, Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the swirling brown chaos from which he had come, leaving her alone with the throbbing pain in her leg and the lingering, gentle weight of his coat. The storm blew itself out by late afternoon, leaving behind a world remade in a uniform coat of brown dust and a sky washed clean and pale. The silence that followed was as profound as the earlier noise. Later, her ankle tightly wrapped with a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat, Alara hobbled to the general store. She needed liniment, more bandages, and a few staples to replace what had been ruined. As she pushed open the door, the small bell above it jingling, she saw Mrs. Gable standing behind the counter, talking in a low, conspiratorial voice with another woman. They fell silent the moment they saw her, their faces pinching with a mixture of surprise and disapproval. Alara ignored them, her limp more pronounced on the solid wood floor as she made her way to the shelves. She gathered what she needed, her movements slow and pained. She could feel their eyes on her back. Then, she heard them start again, their voices hushed to a carrying whisper. "It was the blacksmith who pulled that beam off her," Mrs. Gable said. "My Henry saw him leaving the place." "Is that so?" the other woman replied, her voice laced with meaning. "Well, I suppose it figures. That one is nothing but trouble, and he is half savage besides. Birds of a feather, they say. They, or wolves to a carcass," Mrs. Gable added, and the phrase, sharp and cruel, struck Alara like a slap. One cursed, the other an outcast. Misery loves company. I always say, he probably only helped her thinking she is the only creature in this town as lonely as he is. Alara's shoulders tightened. She stood perfectly still for a moment, her hand resting on a tin of coffee. She wanted to turn, to say something, to throw their ugly words back in their faces. But what was the use? They had already judged her, had already written her story. She was the calamity girl, and he was the half-breed. In their small, fearful minds, it was a story that made perfect sense. Without turning around, she placed her items on the counter, laid her coins down, and walked out of the store. The bell's cheerful jingle a mocking farewell. That evening, as the last of the light bled from the sky, she sat in the rocking chair, her bandaged ankle propped up on a crate. The gaping hole in her roof revealed a swath of deepening twilight sky, already pricked with the first faint stars. The air was cool and clean. She felt a familiar despair begin to settle over her. She was trapped, injured, in a town that hated her, in a cabin that could not even keep out the sky. A shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up, her heart lurching, to see Cale standing there. Over his shoulder, he carried a new, cleanly hewn wooden beam. He did not ask permission. He simply stepped inside, ducking his head to clear the low frame, and set the beam down. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his eyes assessing the damage. For the next hour, he worked. Using a small ladder he must have brought from his smithy, he cleared away the debris and, with a strength that seemed effortless, hoisted the new beam into place. Securing it with heavy nails, he drove in with 3 sure blows of a hammer each. When he was finished, the hole was gone. The roof was stronger than it had ever been. He gathered his tools in silence. "Wait," Alara said, her voice quiet. He paused at the door, turning to look at her. "I have coffee." It was all she had to offer. He considered her for a long moment, then gave that same slow, almost imperceptible nod. She hobbled to the small, cold stove and managed to build a small fire and brew a pot of the weak, bitter coffee. She poured it into 2 tin cups and handed one to him. He took it, his large, rough fingers brushing against hers. He sat not in a chair but on his heels, his back against the wall, a position of practiced patience. They drank in near silence as the last of the daylight faded completely, leaving the small cabin illuminated only by the faint, flickering glow from the stove. The quiet between them was not empty or awkward. It was a space filled with unspoken things, a shared understanding of what it meant to be alone, to be judged, to have the world's harshness as your most constant companion. He did not offer words of comfort, and she did not offer words of thanks. The repaired roof, the shared cup of coffee, they were a language all their own. When he finished his coffee, he stood, placing the empty cup on the floor. He looked at her one last time, his dark eyes holding hers in the dim light. Then, he was gone, melting back into the night as quietly as he had arrived. Elara sat for a long time in the gathering dark, listening to the sound of the wind. For the first time, it did not sound like a moan of loneliness. It sounded only like the wind, and inside her small, repaired cabin, she felt the first fragile tendril of a bond begin to take root in the desolate soil of her heart. His visits began a few nights after the storm. He would appear as the sky was turning from dusty rose to deep indigo, a tall, silent shape detaching himself from the twilight. He never knocked, but would simply wait by the door until she opened it, as if he knew she was aware of his presence. In his hands, he always carried something. The first time, it was a knife, not a weapon, but a kitchen knife with a blade of dark, folded steel that gleamed even in the faint light, sharp enough to shave a sliver from a thumbnail. Its handle was of smooth, polished hickory, shaped to fit a woman's hand. He had seen her struggling to cut salt pork with the dull, pitted blade she had bought at the general store. Another night, he brought a heavy, intricate lock of iron and brass, complete with a long, sturdy key. He spent half an hour fitting it to her flimsy door, his movements precise and unhurried. When he was done, the door shut with a solid, satisfying clunk, a sound of security she had not known for a very long time. He brought her things of substance, things he had made with his own hands, things that said more than words ever could. "You are not safe here. Let me help you be safer." Their conversations were like the first tentative drops of rain after a long drought. They spoke of practical things, the weather, the price of flour, the way a certain kind of wood burned slow and hot. He would sit on his heels, his back against the wall, a cup of her weak coffee held in his large hands, and he would watch her as she spoke, his gaze steady and unnervingly present. She found herself talking more than she had in months, the words coming out rusty and strange. She told him about her father's skill with horses, the way her mother's garden used to grow. Small, simple stories of a life that now felt like a dream. He listened. It was a skill he had perfected, a stillness of the body and mind that made people feel they were the only person in the world. He never interrupted, never offered useless platitudes. He simply took her words and held them, giving them a weight and a reality she had thought they had lost. One night, as a sliver of moon hung in the black sky, she found herself speaking of the end. The words came unbidden, her voice a low, raw monotone that did not sound like her own. "The air smelled of pine smoke," she began, her eyes fixed on a crack in the floorboards. "My father had just brought in a fresh load for the hearth. I remember the sound of my mother humming. She was mending my brother's shirt by the firelight. It was a silly tune, one she had made up herself." She paused, her throat tight. Cale did not move, his presence a solid, unshakable thing in the small, lamp-lit cabin. "They came on horseback. I did not hear them until they were right there. It was the dogs that gave them away. A sudden, panicked barking that was cut short. My father went to the door. He thought it was a neighbor." Her hands, resting in her lap, clenched into fists. "The first gunshot was so loud, it made the whole cabin shake. I remember the smell of gunpowder and the surprised look on my father's face before he fell, and the screaming, my mother screaming." She told him everything, not in a flood of tears, but in a series of sharp, disconnected images. The splintering of the door, the shattered glass of the lamp, plunging the room into a battle of shadows and firelight, the vacant, merciless eyes of the men, the small, wooden bird her brother had been carving, clutched in his hand even as he lay still. She spoke until the horror was laid bare between them, a raw and bleeding thing in the quiet of the room. When she finished, a shudder racked her body, a single, violent tremor. She did not weep. She thought, perhaps, that she had forgotten how. Cale remained silent for a long time, the lamp casting deep shadows across the hard planes of his face. She felt a sudden shame, a need to apologize for burdening him with her darkness. But before she could speak, he did. "My father was a trapper," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He passed through my mother's village one winter and stayed until the spring thaw. He had hair the color of corn silk and eyes as blue as a summer sky. My mother said he promised to come back for her." Cale's mouth twisted in a bitter line. He never did. He left her with a son whose face was a constant reminder of him, a face that did not belong. He looked at his own hands, turning them over as if they were foreign objects. "The other children in the village called me Ghost Face. I learned to fight before I learned to read. My mother, she loved me, but she could not protect me from their suspicion. When the soldiers came, it was that suspicion that killed her. There was a raid. A few of their horses were stolen. They blamed the Pawnee. They always blamed the Pawnee." His voice grew harder, each word chipped from stone. "They rode into our camp at dawn. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. I was 14. I hid in a creek bed, buried in the mud, and I watched. I watched them burn our lodges. I watched them kill her." He looked up then, and in his dark eyes, Alara saw a pain that perfectly mirrored her own. It was the haunted, hollowed-out look of the sole survivor. "I made my way to the white man's towns after that. My face, my name. It was no good with my mother's people, and my blood was no good here. There is a fire that comes with that kind of loneliness, a rage that needs a place to go. For a long time, I let it burn me up from the inside. Then I found the forge." He gestured vaguely toward the town. "The fire in the forge. I can control. I can take that heat, that rage, and I can hammer it into something useful, something strong. It is the only place in this world I am not a ghost." The confession hung in the air, a raw and powerful truth that bound them together more tightly than any chain. They were two halves of the same story, two people forged in the crucible of loss, their shared pain a language only they could understand. That night, something shifted. The fragile tendril of their bond thickened, strengthened, and began to grow into something far deeper. Their relationship became a secret world, a hidden sanctuary from the cold judgment of Redemption Creek. As her ankle healed and her strength returned, Cale began to lead her out of the town and into the surrounding wilderness. He knew the land intimately, not as a thing to be conquered and tamed, but as a living entity to be respected. He showed her hidden canyons where the rock walls were streaked with veins of red and orange, where the silence was so profound you could hear the beat of your own heart. He taught her which plants were good for medicine and which berries were safe to eat. In his world, away from the prying eyes of the town, Alara felt herself begin to breathe again. The tight, cold knot of fear in her chest began to loosen. One evening, he took her to a high mesa that overlooked the vast, broken country to the west. They sat on a sun-warmed slab of rock and watched as the sun began its slow descent. It was a spectacle of impossible beauty. The sky bled through 1,000 shades of gold, crimson, and violet. Long, dark shadows stretched from the canyons, and the distant mountains turned to purple silhouettes against the fiery horizon. They did not speak. There was no need. The beauty and the silence were enough. In that moment, sitting beside him, shoulder to shoulder, Alara felt a sense of peace so pure and complete it almost made her ache. For the first time since the fire, she was not just a survivor. She was a woman, watching a sunset with a man who saw her, all of her, and was not afraid. Cale turned his head and looked at her, his expression soft in the fading light. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple gesture, But it was a vow, a promise of shared solitude, a claiming. In their private world, under the vast, indifferent sky, their love was the only thing that was real. But their world could not remain private forever. A shadow was looming, and its name was Caleb Thorne. Thorne was the owner of the sprawling T-Bar Ranch, a man whose wealth and influence held Redemption Creek in a state of perpetual debt. He was handsome in a severe, predatory way, with cold blue eyes and a confidence that came from a life of never being denied anything. He was the town's king, and he believed everything in it, including its people, belonged to him in one way or another. He had noticed Alara, of course. He noticed every new face. He had watched her from a distance, his eyes lingering on the pale fragility of her face and the haunted look in her eyes. He did not see a woman. He saw a challenge, a beautiful, broken thing that he, and only he, could possess and repair. He saw her as a wild mare that needed a firm hand and a strong bit. His approach came one afternoon when Alara was in the general store. He entered the store, his silver spurs jingling on the floorboards, and the entire atmosphere changed. Mrs. Gable, who was usually so sour, suddenly beamed. Another customer, a farmer, quickly finished his business and scurried out. Thorne tipped his hat to Alara, a smile playing on his lips that did not reach his eyes. "Miss," he began, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that was jarringly out of place in the dusty store. "Caleb Thorne. I believe we have not been properly introduced." Alara inclined her head. "Sir." "I have heard of your troubles," he continued, his gaze sweeping over her worn dress with a look that was part pity, part appraisal. "A terrible tragedy. This is a hard country for anyone, let alone a woman on her own. It is no place for you to be living in that shack at the edge of town." He moved closer, his presence seeming to suck the air from the room. "I have a proposition for you. I have a fine house. I can offer you safety, comfort, a new wardrobe. You would want for nothing. The good people of this town would see you under my protection, and their suspicions would vanish overnight. All I ask in return is your companionship." The offer was plain. He was not offering marriage. He was offering a gilded cage. He was offering to buy her, to make her another one of his fine possessions. The insult was so profound, so dismissive of who she was, that it burned away any fear she might have felt. She met his cold blue eyes without flinching. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I am not in need of your protection. I am content with what I have." Thorne's smile tightened. He was not used to being refused. "Content?" he scoffed softly. "Living in filth, taking charity from the town half-breed? You are a woman of quality. You should not be associating with the likes of him." The mention of Cale sent a chill of fury through her. "Mr. Cale has been a better neighbor to me than anyone else in this town," she said, her voice dropping. "And he is not charity. He is my friend." Thorne's face hardened, the charming facade cracking to reveal the cold arrogance beneath. "A friend," he repeated, the word an insult. "I see. I had heard the whispers, but I did not believe a woman like you would stoop so low. You are making a mistake, a grave one." He held her gaze for a moment longer, his eyes promising a retribution she could not yet fathom. Then he turned on his heel and strode out of the store, the jingle of his spurs sounding like a threat. After that, the town's cold shoulder became a more aggressive shove. Thorne's influence was everywhere. The livery owner suddenly had no grain to sell her for the mule she had managed to acquire. Mrs. Gable found a reason to be out of whatever staple Alara came to buy. A group of Thorne's ranch hands took to loitering near the smithy, making loud, crude remarks about Cale and his white squaw whenever he or Alara was near. The prejudice that had once been a quiet, simmering thing was now being actively stirred by Thorne's wounded pride. They were being pushed further and further to the edge, their small, private world under siege. The pressure mounted, a slow, grinding weight on them both. One evening, Cale came to her cabin later than usual. He was bone-weary, his face etched with a silent fury. One of Thorne's men had brought in a horse to be shod and had deliberately provoked him, insulting his mother, trying to bait him into a fight. Cale had held his tongue. His rage banked like the coals in his forge, but the effort had cost him dearly. He stood in the center of her small cabin, his powerful frame seeming to fill the entire space. He looked trapped, a storm of anger and frustration contained within him. Alara went to him, placing her hands on his chest. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the heavy, furious beat of his heart. She looked up into his face, into the turmoil in his dark eyes. "He wants to break you," she said softly. "He wants to break us." "He will not," Cale growled, his voice thick with a dangerous emotion. "He will not touch you. He will not touch us." In that moment, the world outside the cabin, the hatred, the prejudice, the suffocating judgment of Redemption Creek and the cold obsession of Caleb Thorne ceased to exist. There was only the flickering lamplight, the charged silence, and the two of them, standing together against it all. A desperate, aching need rose between them, a desire that was more than just physical. It was a need to affirm what they had, to claim it, to make it real and solid in a world that wished to see it destroyed. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was fierce, hungry, a release of all the pent-up anger, fear, and longing they had both been carrying. It was a kiss of desperation and defiance. His hands moved from her waist to her back, pulling her tight against him, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. There were no words. There was no hesitation. This was not a surrender. It was a declaration, an act of rebellion fought not with fists or guns, but with a desperate, beautiful, and profound intimacy. He lifted her into his arms and carried her the few steps to her narrow bed. In the golden lamplight, they came together, their bodies finally speaking the language their souls had known for months. It was a claiming. For Alara, it was the reclamation of a body that had known only terror, finding solace and reverence in a touch that was wanted. For Cale, it was a moment of belonging, of finding a home in another person's arms after a lifetime of being an outcast. They clung to each other in the darkness, two lonely souls forging a union in the heart of the fire, their passion a defiant answer to the world's hatred, a desperate, beautiful claiming of one another. Their union, forged in the quiet privacy of the cabin, was a secret that could not be kept. In a town as small and watchful as Redemption Creek, intimacy was a public commodity. The whispers that had followed them like stray dogs now grew fangs. The change was palpable, a souring of the very air they breathed. People who had once offered Alara a grudging nod now turned their faces away, their mouths set in thin, hard lines of disapproval. When she walked down the main street, conversations would cease, leaving a wake of pointed silence. Mothers would pull their children aside as she passed, as if her very shadow could transmit a contagion of sorrow and sin. Cale felt it at his forge. Business, which had always been a steady if resentful stream, began to dry up. Men he had known for years, who relied on his skill to mend their plows and shoe their horses, now began to make the long ride to the next town, preferring the inconvenience to the perceived stain of doing business with him. One rancher, a man named Peters, came to collect a set of hinges Cale had repaired. He threw the coins on the anvil, avoiding Cale's eyes. "This will be the last time," Peters said, his voice low and tight with a shame that masqueraded as anger. "The wife, she does not want your work in our house." He gathered his things and left, leaving Cale standing in the ringing silence of his smithy, the insult a colder blow than any fist. The poison, once unleashed, found its way to the pulpit. The following Sunday, Reverend Miller, a man with a weak chin and a booming voice that was perpetually at odds with the fear in his eyes, delivered a sermon that all but named them. Alara and Cale were not there, but the words echoed through the town all week. He spoke of the sanctity of a community, of the dangers of inviting darkness into their fold. He preached about the stain of tragedy, suggesting that some sorrows were so deep they tainted the ground a person walked on, attracting further misfortune. Then, his voice rising with a righteous fervor fueled by Caleb Thorne's patronage, he warned against the unnatural mixing of blood, of diluting the flock with natures that were wild and untamed. He did not need to be more specific. Every soul in that church knew of whom he spoke, the cursed woman and the savage blacksmith. The sermon gave the town's prejudice a holy permission. The hostility was now open and unashamed. It was a war of 1,000 tiny cuts, and Caleb Thorne was the general directing the assault from his throne of wealth and influence. He was enraged by their defiance, by the fact that the beautiful, broken thing he had wished to possess had found solace not in his gilded cage, but in the arms of a man he considered less than human. His pride, a vast and fragile thing, had been wounded, and his desire had curdled into a black and patient obsession. He would not have her, so he would destroy what she had. The attack came on a moonless night a week later. Cale had been forced to take a job delivering a custom-built gear mechanism for a water pump to a farm a full day's ride away. The work was too important, the pay too necessary to refuse. He had hated leaving her alone. His last look a mixture of worry and a deep, unspoken tenderness. He had checked the new lock on her door himself, a small reassurance against a world of threats. Alara had spent the evening mending a tear in her dress by the light of a single tallow lamp. The wind was restless, scraping the branches of a dead tree against the side of the cabin, making her start at every scrape and groan. A deep sense of unease had settled over her, a familiar cold dread that she could not shake. She barred the door, the solid thud of Cale's lock a small comfort, and retired to her narrow bed, her sleep a thin and troubled thing. She woke to the smell first, not wood smoke, but something sharp, oily, and foul. Kerosene? Her eyes snapped open in the pitch darkness. Then came a sound, a soft liquid sloshing against the outside wall, followed by the scrape of a match. A sudden, hungry whoosh of ignited fuel made the entire cabin wall bloom with a terrifying orange light that pulsed through the cracks in the planks. Panic, stark and absolute, seized her. For a frozen second, she was back in another time, another fire, the screams of her family echoing in her ears. Then instinct took over. The flames were already licking up the dry, tinder-like wood, the crackle growing into a roar. Smoke, thick and black, began to pour through the walls. She threw herself from the bed, choking, her eyes streaming. The main wall was already a sheet of fire. The door, the way out, was engulfed. She scrambled to the cabin's single, small window. The latch was swollen and stuck. She beat against the frame with her bare hands, splinters digging into her palms, her mind screaming. The heat was becoming unbearable, the air a poison that burned her lungs. Outside, she could hear the muffled sound of men's laughter, a cruel, triumphant sound that spurred her to a final, desperate effort. With a cry that was half sob, half roar, she threw her shoulder against the window frame. The rotten wood gave way with a splintering crack, and she tumbled out into the cold night air, landing hard on the unforgiving dirt. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs, and turned to look back. The cabin was an inferno. Flames clawed at the night sky, devouring the small sanctuary she and Cale had built, consuming the few possessions she had gathered, erasing the quiet moments of peace they had found there. It was all gone. Again, everything she had touched, everything that had meant home, had been turned to ash. She saw them then, 3 dark shapes on horseback, silhouetted against the terrible light of the fire. One of them sat taller in the saddle, his posture one of arrogant satisfaction. Caleb Thorne. He watched the flames for a long moment, as a man might watch a piece of work well done, before turning his horse and melting back into the darkness with his men, leaving Alara alone with the roaring destruction. She stood there in her thin nightdress, shivering not from the cold but from a deep, soul-shaking shock. She was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the life she had barely managed to save. It was a devastating, perfect echo of her past, a confirmation of the whispered curse she carried. She was a vessel for tragedy. Everything she held dear was destined for the fire. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply stood and watched her world burn for the second time, the bright, hungry flames reflected in her wide, tearless eyes. Cale saw the glow in the sky when he was still 5 miles out, a sick, unnatural orange that pulsed against the bruised purple of the pre-dawn horizon. At first, he thought it was a wildfire, a common enough threat in the dry season. But as he drew closer, a cold knot of dread tightened in his gut. The glow was in the exact direction of Redemption Creek, of her cabin. He spurred his horse into a desperate gallop, the animal's hooves pounding a frantic rhythm of fear against the hard-packed earth. He did not need to ride into town. He saw the smoldering skeleton of the cabin from the trail. It was a black, jagged wound on the landscape, a plume of greasy gray smoke still rising into the clean morning air, and beside it, a small, huddled figure, Alara. He vaulted from the saddle before his horse had even come to a full stop and ran to her. She was sitting in the dirt, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face and nightdress smudged with soot. She was staring into the smoking ruins with an unnerving, vacant stillness. She did not seem to see him until he was kneeling in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. Alara. Her name was a rough, broken sound in his throat. She looked at him then, and the emptiness in her eyes terrified him more than any tears could have. "It is all gone, Cale," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping thing. "Everything." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable shuddering that seemed to come from the very marrow of her bones. He looked past her at the ruins. He saw the shattered window frame she must have escaped through. He saw the charred remains of the door, the blackened, twisted metal of the lock he had so carefully forged and installed. And in that moment, the carefully controlled anger he had lived with his entire life, the rage he channeled and shaped in the fire of his forge, boiled over. It was not a hot, explosive fury. It was a cold, silent, and absolutely lethal rage that settled in his heart like a block of ice. He knew who had done this. There was no question. Caleb Thorne. He gently set Alara back, his hands framing her face. "Stay here," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I will be back." He stood up and turned toward his horse. His intention was as clear and sharp as a newly forged blade. He was going to ride into town. He was going to find Thorne, and he was going to kill him. "No!" Alara's voice, though quiet, was sharp with sudden panic. She struggled to her feet and grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No, Cale, you cannot." "He tried to kill you," Cale said, his voice a low growl. He did not look at her, his eyes fixed on the town in the distance. "He burned our home." "And he will kill you," she pleaded, her fingers digging into his flesh. "That is what he wants. Do you not see? He wants you to come for him. The sheriff is his man. The whole town is his. They will call it self-defense. They will hang you, and it will all be legal. He will win. He will have taken you from me, too." Her words, desperate and true, were the only thing that could have stopped him. He stood frozen for a long moment, his body rigid with the violence he was holding back. The battle within him was immense, the desire for vengeance warring with the fierce, protective love he felt for the woman clinging to his arm. Slowly, painfully, he relaxed his clenched fists. The cold rage did not disappear, but he forced it back down, banking the fire, though he knew the coals would glow hot within him for a very long time. He turned back to her, his face a mask of anguish. He sank to his knees in the ash and pulled her down with him, holding her as if he could absorb her pain into himself. They clung to each other in the gray light of dawn, surrounded by the ruins of their life and the hatred of the world. It was the lowest point, the deepest pit of despair either of them had ever known. They had nothing left but each other. It was there, in the ashes of their home, that Cale knew what he had to do. He pulled back slightly, just enough to see her face. Her eyes were filled with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. "This town," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "This world, it does not want us. It will not have us. It will try to burn us, to break us, to tear us apart until there is nothing left." He took a deep breath. "So, we will not be a part of it. We will build our own world. Ilara, you and I. We will be our own place, our own people. We will be our own home." He reached up and cupped her soot-stained cheek, his thumb gently wiping away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "Marry me." The words were so unexpected, so stark and beautiful in their desolation, that she could not speak. He was not offering a pretty future. He was offering a shared struggle, a defiant stand. But as the shock receded, a cold, familiar fear crept back in. "Cale," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Look at me. Look at what happens to the people I love, my family, this cabin. Everything I touch turns to ash. It is a curse. It follows me. I cannot let it destroy you, too." This was her deepest fear, the ugly, secret belief that she was a blight upon the world. She finally pulled her gaze up to meet his, expecting to see a flicker of doubt, of fear. But there was none. His eyes were intense, fierce, and filled with a conviction that shook her to her core. "No," he said, his voice low and firm. He brought his other hand up, holding her face between his large, warm palms, forcing her to see the truth in his eyes. "You are not a curse. This pain, the fire, it is not a curse. Ilara, it is the fire we were both forged in. It is how we know we are real." His gaze burned with an intensity that seemed to push the words directly into her soul. "This pain does not break us. It does not destroy us. It is the iron that runs through us both. It is what makes us strong. It binds us. Let the world try to burn us. Our bond was forged in flames. It will not break." His words struck the core of her identity, shattering the cursed image of herself she had carried for so long. He was not afraid of her sorrow. He was claiming it as part of their foundation. He was telling her that their shared brokenness was the source of their wholeness together. Tears, real and cleansing, finally streamed down her face. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, a silent, absolute surrender, a yes. 3 days later, they were married. They found a traveling minister passing through, a weary man with kind eyes who asked no questions and offered no judgment, only a simple service for a few coins. The ceremony was not held in the town's church, which had condemned them. Instead, Cale took her to a quiet, secluded spot by a creek bed miles from town, a place sheltered by ancient cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered in the gentle breeze. Ilara wore her only other dress, washed and mended. Cale wore a clean shirt. There were no flowers, no guests, no celebration. It was a solemn, quiet affair, with only the vast, silent sky and the gurgling creek as their witnesses. They stood before the minister, hand in hand, and made their vows. They were not promises of ease or happiness, but of endurance. They were promises to be a shield, to be an anchor, to be a home for each other when the world offered none. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Cale did not kiss her with passion. He simply raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. It was not a joyful beginning. It was a pact made against the world, a solemn vow whispered in the heart of the wilderness. They were two outcasts, two survivors, and now they were a nation of two, bound by a love that was as fierce, unforgiving, and resilient as the land itself. Cale's home was not a house. It was a space carved from the back of the smithy, a testament to a life of solitary function. There were 2 rooms, one for sleeping, dominated by a narrow bed frame he had forged himself, and another that served as a kitchen and living space, containing a small cast-iron stove, a rough plank table, and 2 chairs. The walls were unadorned stone and wood. The air carried the permanent, metallic scent of the forge, and the only window looked out not on the open plains but on the cluttered yard behind the workshop. It was a place built for necessity, not comfort, a shelter, not a home. To Alara, it was a fortress. After the ashes and the open sky of her ruined cabin, the solid stone walls and sturdy roof felt like the safest place on earth. She brought with her the only thing she had saved from the fire, the clothes on her back and the silver locket from her mother, its surface now dulled with soot. In the first few weeks, she moved quietly through the space, a ghost in her own new life, learning the rhythms of this man who was now her husband. They began to build a life not with grand plans, but with small, repeated actions. She would rise before him at dawn, coaxing a fire to life in the small stove, the smell of coffee a welcome scent against the ever-present smell of coal. She would bring him a cup at the forge, watching for a moment as he worked, the morning light catching the spray of bright sparks from his hammer, his movements a dance of power and precision she never tired of watching. They ate their meals at the small table, often in a comfortable silence that was more intimate than any conversation. In the evenings, by the light of a single lamp, she would mend his work clothes while he sharpened tools, the soft scrape of a whetstone a soothing counterpoint to the chirp of crickets outside. It was a hard life. Their existence was pared down to the bone, a constant struggle for the barest essentials. The town remained a wall of hostility, a place they entered only when absolutely necessary, enduring the cold stares and muttered insults to buy the flour and salt they could not make for themselves. But within the stone walls of their small home, they found a quiet rhythm. Alara's presence began to soften the space's hard edges. She stitched curtains from old flour sacks for the single window. She found a tin can to use as a vase for the stubborn, hardy wildflowers she found growing by the creek. Slowly, painstakingly, she was turning his shelter into their home. They found their comfort not in things, for they had almost none, but in each other's presence. A shared look across the room, the brush of his hand against hers as she gave him his plate, the warmth of his body next to hers in the narrow bed at night. These were the small, sturdy bricks with which they built their world. The first glimmers of real hope came from a discovery born of necessity. Cale had a small pile of leather scraps, remnants from harness repairs he had done months before. One afternoon, while he was busy at the forge, Alara took a piece of the stiff, worn leather and one of the sharpened nails he used for marking wood. With patient, careful hands, she began to etch a design into the surface, a trailing vine with delicate, curling leaves. She lost herself in the work, her focus absolute, the world outside her small circle of concentration fading away. She had a natural, untrained talent, an artist's eye for balance and a steady hand for detail. When Cale came in for a drink of water, he found her hunched over the table, a look of intense concentration on her face. He looked over her shoulder at her work and fell silent. He saw not just a doodle, but a thing of intricate, unexpected beauty. He said nothing, but the next day, he presented her with a set of tools. He had forged them himself, small, fine-tipped implements of steel with smooth wooden handles, perfect for tooling and carving leather. It was his way of giving his approval, his encouragement. It was his way of saying, "I see you." With the proper tools, her talent blossomed. Cale, in turn, began to teach her some of the finer points of his own craft, showing her how to heat and shape small pieces of metal, how to hammer soft silver into delicate inlays. They began to work together, a partnership of steel and leather, fire and patience. He would forge a beautiful, perfectly balanced knife, and she would carve its wooden handle with the image of a hawk's feather or a running deer. He would repair a bridle, and she would tool its straps with a pattern of wild roses so lifelike they seemed to climb the leather. They were creating things that were not just functional, but beautiful, unique items that bore the mark of their combined skill. They could not sell their work in Redemption Creek, but the stagecoach still passed through twice a week. One day, Cale flagged down the driver, a man named Silas who was more interested in coin than town gossip. He showed Silas one of their knives. The man's eyes widened at the quality of the work. He bought it on the spot and asked if they had more. Soon, they had a small but steady trade, bypassing Thorne and the town completely. They sold their goods to Silas and to the occasional traveling merchant who was shrewd enough to recognize true craftsmanship. Each coin they earned felt like a victory, a small act of defiance that allowed them to buy a little more flour, a side of bacon, a new bolt of cloth. For the first time, it felt as if they were not just surviving, but building. It was in the midst of this small, fragile prosperity that Alara realized her life was about to change once more. It began with a weariness in her bones that she could not shake, and a sudden sickness that overtook her each morning. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion from her work, but as the days turned into weeks, a dawning, heart-stopping realization took hold. One evening, as she and Cale sat at their table, she placed her hand over her still flat belly and looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder.
"Cale," she whispered, I think I am with child."
He froze, a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. He looked at her hand, then at her face, his dark eyes searching hers. He saw the truth there, the fear and the overwhelming joy all mingled together. A storm of emotions seemed to pass over his face, disbelief, then awe, and finally, a fierce, primal protectiveness that was so powerful it was almost frightening. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. He did not smile, but the look in his eyes was more tender than any smile could ever be. The news settled between them, a thing of profound and terrifying significance. They were creating a new life, a tiny, helpless symbol of their love and their defiance. The joy of it was a pure, sharp ache in Alara's chest. A child, a family, something to erase the ghosts of the past and build a real future. But shadowing that joy was a deep and gnawing fear. What kind of world were they bringing this child into? A world that hated its father for his blood and its mother for her sorrow? The stakes of their survival had just been raised immeasurably. Their fight was no longer just for themselves. Caleb Thorne could not tolerate their survival. From his grand ranch house, he had watched their small acts of defiance, and it gnawed at him like a cancer. He had tried to break them with fire, and they had risen from the ashes bound together. He had tried to crush them with social ostracism, and they had simply turned their backs on the town and created their own world. Their quiet dignity was a constant, infuriating affront to his power. He could not stand the sight of their resilience, of the love that so clearly sustained them. He decided that if he could not break their spirits, he would break their bodies. He would starve them out. His campaign of economic warfare was subtle, but devastating. The stagecoach driver, Silas, suddenly stopped buying their goods, his face apologetic and his eyes nervous. He mumbled something about new company rules, but Cale knew it was Thorne's doing. A traveling merchant who had promised to return for a large order of bridles never appeared. Then the supply lines were cut. A shipment of coal for the forge, already paid for, was mysteriously lost on the trail. The tanner in the next town who sold Cale his leather suddenly had none to spare. Thorne's influence spread like a web, and they were caught in the center of it. Every avenue of hope slowly being choked off. As if the hand of man were not cruel enough, nature itself seemed to turn against them. A long, brutal drought settled over the region. The sun became a merciless, brassy disk in a sky that was white with heat. The creek slowed to a muddy trickle. The grass on the plains turned a pale, brittle yellow, and the earth cracked like old pottery. Dust was a constant presence, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything, that got into their food, their water, their lungs. The landscape became a reflection of their struggle, harsh, barren, and unforgiving. The drought frayed the nerves of everyone in Redemption Creek. Tempers grew short as resources became scarce. The hostility directed at Cale and Alara intensified, as if they were somehow to blame for the failing wells and the dying cattle. The town needed a scapegoat for its misery, and the two outcasts at the smithy were the easiest target. Their small stockpile of coins dwindled, then vanished. They were forced to ration their food, their small meals growing smaller and smaller. Cale took his rifle into the hills, but the game had fled the dry land. He came back day after day, empty-handed, his face etched with a deep, weary frustration. The lines of strain began to show on both of them. Alara grew thinner, her face paler, her eyes seeming larger in her gaunt face. Cale's movements lost some of their fluid power, replaced by a grim, dogged determination. They were being pushed to the edge, the world doing its level best to prove that their love could not survive the harsh realities that Thorn controlled. But the pressure did not break them. It did not create cracks in their bond. Instead, it fused them together, burning away everything that was not essential, leaving only the unbreakable core of their commitment. The hardship became a crucible, and their love was tempered in its heat, growing stronger, harder, more resilient with every passing day. The darkest night came when their food was almost gone. All they had left was a handful of flour and a few withered potatoes. Alara made a thin, watery soup, and they sat at their table, the single small bowl between them. The hunger was a real and constant ache in their bellies. Despair was a shadow in the corner of the room, a cold and patient presence. Cale looked at the soup, then at Alara's tired face, and a look of profound pain crossed his own. He pushed the bowl toward her. "You eat," he said, his voice rough. "You and the child." Alara pushed it back. "We share. We always share." He finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw and terrible anguish. "I am sorry, Alara," he whispered, the words torn from him. "I brought you to this. I promised you a home, a life, and I have given you nothing but starvation." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, not from hunger or despair, but from the depth of her love for this man, for his pride and his pain. She reached across the table and took his hands. They were still strong hands, but they were thinner now, the calluses stark against the pale skin. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You listen to me, Cale. You have given me everything. Before you, I was not living. I was a ghost. I was just waiting to die. You gave me a reason to live. You taught me how to fight back." She squeezed his hands, her gaze fierce and unwavering. "This hunger, it is nothing. Thorn's hate, it is nothing. They cannot take what is most important. They cannot take this. They cannot take us." She stood up and walked around the table to stand behind him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, pressing her cheek against his hair. He leaned back into her embrace, a long, shuddering sigh escaping him. "Our child will not be born into a world of hate," she continued, her voice a soft, steely promise against his ear. "Our child will be born into a world of love. This love, right here. That is the world we are building. I do not care if we have nothing but the clothes on our backs and the dirt beneath our feet. As long as I have you, I have everything I will ever need. We will not break. Cale, we will not." He reached up and covered her hands with his own, holding them tight against his chest. They stayed that way for a long time, two people with nothing left but each other, finding in their unity a strength that no fire, no hatred, and no hunger could ever hope to extinguish. The pain of their struggle was real, a sharp and bitter thing. But in the heart of that pain, they found not despair, but a profound and unbreakable truth. Their love was not just a comfort in their hardship. It was their weapon against it. It was their food, their fire, their home. It was their survival. Caleb Thorne had underestimated them. He had believed that hardship was like water, and that enough of it could quench any fire. He had thrown poverty, isolation, and finally, real fire at them, expecting their bond to hiss and turn to steam, leaving behind nothing but bitter regrets. Instead, he had watched, his rage a cold, hard knot in his stomach, as the fire he had set seemed only to temper them, to forge their separate strengths into a single, unbreakable alloy. Their quiet, dogged survival was a personal insult, a daily testament to his failure. He realized then that their love was not a flame to be quenched. It was a root system, growing deeper and stronger in the harshest soil. To kill it, he would have to tear it out of the ground completely. The instrument of his cruelty arrived in the form of a man named Jedediah Morse. He was a prospector, a man with a wild look in his eyes and a stubborn set to his jaw. His skin baked the color of the red earth he spent his life sifting. He had come to Cale weeks before with a broken pickaxe and a cracked pan, and Cale had repaired them with his usual skill. The argument, when it came, was loud and public, staged perfectly in the heat of the afternoon in the wide, dusty space before the smithy. "This is robbery!" Morse shouted, his voice cracking with indignation. He threw the coins Cale had asked for onto the anvil, where they rang with a tinny, inadequate sound. "Twice what any honest man would charge." Cale, his face impassive, did not look at the coins. He looked at the man. "I charged you the price we agreed upon," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The work is good. The steel will hold." "The steel better hold, for what I paid for it," Morse snarled. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the prospect of conflict. Two of Thorne's ranch hands, who had been loitering nearby, watched with particular interest. "You think, because you are the only smith in this cursed town, you can cheat a man? I have got half a mind to take it out of your hide." "The price is fair," Cale repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. He did not move, but his stillness was more menacing than any threat. "Take your tools and go." Morse, emboldened by his audience, jabbed a finger at Cale. "I will not forget this. No one gets the better of Jedediah Morse. You will regret this day." He snatched his tools and stormed off, trailing a stream of curses behind him, leaving the town with a perfect public memory of a bitter dispute. Cale watched him go, then calmly swept the coins from the anvil into his hand and turned back to the fire, the argument already dismissed from his mind. He did not see Caleb Thorne watching from the shade of the saloon's porch, a thin, satisfied smile on his face. 3 days later, a boy chasing a stray dog found Morse's body in a dry wash a mile from town. He had been stabbed once, a single, brutal thrust to the heart. The news spread through Redemption Creek like a fever. Murder was a rare and terrifying event, and it ripped through the town's thin veneer of civility, exposing the raw fear and prejudice that lay just beneath the surface. By midday, the sheriff, a man named Beauregard, whose authority was entirely dependent on Thorne's goodwill, had ridden out to the scene. When he returned, he went straight to the saloon. Caleb Thorne was there, holding court, his expression one of grave concern. "It is a bad business." "Sheriff," Thorne said, pouring the man a glass of whiskey. "A very bad business. Any idea who could have done such a thing?" The sheriff downed the whiskey in one gulp. "Found this a few feet from the body," he said, his voice heavy with importance. He unwrapped a piece of cloth to reveal a knife. It was not a common blade. It was one of Cale's, unmistakable in its craftsmanship. The blade was dark, patterned steel, and the handle was of polished mesquite, carved with the intricate image of a coiled rattlesnake. It was a unique, custom piece Cale had displayed in the smithy for months, waiting for a buyer. A murmur went through the saloon. Thorne picked up the knife, examining it as if he had never seen it before. "Well now," he said softly, his voice full of a terrible, feigned revelation. "I believe I know this work, and I seem to recall a certain prospector having a rather loud disagreement with the man who made it, just the other day." He let the implication hang in the air. Thick and poisonous. He looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of the other men. "We have all seen the temper on him," Thorne continued, his voice taking on a tone of somber warning. "He keeps it banked, like the coals in his forge, but the fire is there. It is in his blood, that savage blood. It runs hot. It is a tragedy, but perhaps it is not a surprise. A man can only deny his nature for so long before it shows its true colors." He had given them the story they wanted to hear, a story that confirmed their deepest fears and ugliest prejudices. The half-breed, the outcast, had finally snapped. The quiet, resentful man had revealed the beast within. Thorne's words were the match, and the town's long simmering racism was the tinder. The fire caught instantly. Sheriff Beauregard, his course now clear, puffed out his chest. "I will need a posse," he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound authority that was merely a reflection of Thorne's. They rode to the smithy in a cloud of self-righteous dust, a dozen men with rifles in their hands and a thirst for simple, violent answers in their hearts. Ilara was outside, hanging a mended shirt on a line. When she saw them coming, a cold dread seized her. They moved with the grim purpose of a lynch mob, their faces hard and closed. They stormed into the smithy without a word. Cale was working, his back to them, the rhythmic clang of his hammer the only sound. He turned as they entered, his face showing a weary surprise that quickly hardened into a guarded watchfulness. "Cale," the sheriff said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, "you are under arrest for the murder of Jedediah Morse." Cale's eyes narrowed, but he did not speak. He simply looked from the sheriff's face to the hate-filled faces of the men behind him. "No!" Ilara cried, running forward. "He did not do anything. He was here, with me." One of Thorne's men, a brutish ranch hand named Finch, grabbed her arm and shoved her roughly aside. "Stay out of this, squaw." Cale moved then, a blur of motion, a low snarl ripping from his throat. He took one step toward Finch before two other men leveled their rifles at his chest. He froze, his hands clenched into fists, his body radiating a lethal fury. "Do not make this difficult," the sheriff said, his voice unsteady. "We found the knife. Cale, your knife." Cale's eyes flickered with a dawning, terrible understanding. He looked past the sheriff, his gaze sweeping over the posse, and he saw the truth. He saw Thorne's hand in this as clearly as if the man himself were standing there. He was perfectly and expertly framed. They bound his hands behind his back with a rough rope, the men's movements unnecessarily harsh. Ilara fought, pleading, her voice raw with desperation. "You cannot do this! He is innocent! This is a mistake!" They ignored her as if she were not there. They dragged Cale out into the harsh sunlight, a prisoner of their fear and hate. As they pulled him onto a horse, he looked at Ilara. His face was a mask of stone, but in his eyes, she saw a universe of anguish, of love, of a desperate, silent command. "Be strong." Then they were gone, riding back toward town, leaving her standing alone in the sudden, deafening silence. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. She stumbled back into the smithy, the place suddenly feeling vast and empty. The forge was still warm, the air thick with the smell of him. She reached out and touched the anvil, the cold, hard steel that was so much a part of him. A single, dry sob escaped her lips. The story's darkest point had arrived. She was alone, carrying his child, and her husband was being led away to be hanged. The town, which had once been a place of cold shoulders, now became a landscape of open hatred. As she walked the single street toward the jail, a desperate, hopeless need to see him driving her forward. She felt their eyes on her like stones. They blamed her, in their twisted logic. She was the catalyst. The cursed woman who had brought this darkness upon them by consorting with the savage. She was the one who had unleashed the beast. The women who had once snubbed her now glared with a vicious, triumphant malice. She was getting what she deserved. The jail was a small, squalid box of stone and iron bars at the end of the street. The sheriff sat in a chair out front, tilted back, a shotgun across his lap. He would not let her see Cale. "He is a dangerous murderer," Beauregard said, not looking at her.
"No visitors." "He is my husband," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "He is innocent."
"The circuit judge will be here in a week," the sheriff said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He can tell his story then. Now get out of here. Your presence is agitating the good folk of this town." She turned away, defeated, the weight of a world's hatred pressing down on her. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing pressure in her chest that made it hard to breathe. The old fear, the one she thought she had conquered, came whispering back. The curse, it had found him, just as she had feared. Everything she loved, it destroyed. For a long, dark hour, she let the despair wash over her, let it fill the empty spaces inside her. She felt herself begin to break. But as she stood in the empty smithy, surrounded by the powerful, tangible evidence of the man she loved, something shifted. She ran a hand over her belly, over the slight, firm swell that held their future. She thought of Cale's face as they dragged him away, the command in his eyes, "Be strong." The grief did not vanish, but it crystallized. It turned from a suffocating fog into a single, hard point of cold, clear rage. Her survival instinct, honed by a lifetime of loss, took over. She would not break. She would not let them win. She would fight. Her one-woman investigation began that night, under a sliver of moon. She crept out to the dry wash where Morse's body had been found. The area was a mess of trampled earth and horse tracks from the posse, but she searched with a methodical desperation. She got down on her hands and knees, her fingers sifting through the dirt and gravel, searching for anything they might have missed, anything that did not belong. She found nothing but rocks and dust, but the act of doing something, of fighting back, kept the despair at bay. The next day, she forced herself to go into town. She needed supplies, but more than that, she needed to listen, to watch. The air was thick with a grim, celebratory mood. The town had its villain, and justice would soon be served. She endured the threats in their stony silences and the intimidation in their glares. As she left the general store, Finch, Thorne's brutish ranch hand, blocked her path. "You best be careful," he said, his voice a low sneer. "Would not want anything to happen to you before you get to see your man swing." He laughed and walked away, leaving her trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. Her psychological state was a fragile, dangerous thing. She ate little, slept less. She spent her hours pacing the smithy, her mind racing, replaying every detail, every conversation, every whisper she had ever heard about Caleb Thorne, about Jedediah Morse. Her resolve was a thin sheet of iron, holding back a flood of grief and terror. She forced herself to think of the argument. She closed her eyes and saw it again. Morse, red-faced and shouting. Cale, solid and immovable. What had Morse said? She filtered out the rage. The insults about payment. There was something else. She remembered the prospector's eyes, the wild, darting fear in them that had been at odds with his blustering anger. He was not just angry. He was scared, and his words came back to her in a sudden, clear rush. "I have got Thorne's men sniffing around my claim as it is, trying to run me off." He had said it in a lower voice, a muttered complaint before he started shouting about the price. At the time, she had dismissed it as the ramblings of an angry man. Now, it was a lightning strike in the darkness of her mind. A secret claim, a rich vein, Thorne trying to run him off. It was not about the broken pickaxe. It was about something far more valuable. And in that moment, a desperate, brilliant hunch took root. The proof of Cale's innocence was not in the town that had already condemned him. It was out there, in the desolate, lawless hills where Morse had spent his last days. She did not hesitate. The risk was enormous. She was a woman, alone and pregnant, heading into a dangerous land where a man could disappear without a trace. But the thought of Cale sitting in that dark cell, waiting for a rope, was a greater danger than anything the wilderness could hold. She packed a small bag with water and a little food, took the sturdy mule they owned, and under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom, she rode out of Redemption Creek, heading for the hills. The landscape was brutal and indifferent, a maze of rocky canyons and sun-scorched mesas. For 2 days, she rode, following a cold trail, guided by nothing more than her hunch and a vague memory of the direction Morse had once indicated. She thought about his paranoia, his secrecy. He would not have made his camp in an obvious place. She searched the hidden places, the narrow box canyons, the sheltered alcoves beneath rocky overhangs. On the evening of the second day, when she was exhausted and near despair, she found it tucked away behind a screen of juniper and rock, almost invisible from the main trail, was a small, hidden camp, a blackened fire ring, a bedroll, a few discarded tins. It was him. It was Morse's secret claim. Her heart pounded as she slid from the mule's back. She searched the camp with a frantic energy. She found his tools, a small bag of ore that glittered with flecks of gold, confirming her suspicion. But it was not enough. She needed something that pointed directly to Thorn. She searched the bedroll, the saddlebags, and found a small, leather-bound journal tucked into a lining. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Morse's handwriting was a rough scrawl, but his words were clear. He wrote of his discovery, a vein of gold richer than anything he had ever found. And he wrote of his fear. He detailed 3 separate encounters with Caleb Thorn, who had somehow learned of his find. Thorn had offered to buy the claim for a pittance. When Morse refused, Thorn had threatened him. The last entry, dated the day before he died, was chilling. Thorn was here again today. He said, "If I will not sell, he will take it." He said, "This land has a way of swallowing men who do not know their place. I am sleeping with my pistol in my hand." She had it. The motive. It was all there, in Morse's own hand. It was proof that Thorn had every reason to want the prospector dead, but it was still Morse's word against the word of the most powerful man in the territory. She needed more. She needed something that put Thorn at the scene of the murder. She went back to the fire ring, sifting through the cold ashes, and then she saw it, half buried in the dirt at the edge of the ring, as if flicked there from a careless hand, was a small, discarded cheroot. It was not a common cigarette. It was wrapped in dark leaf, and around its end was a distinctive, thin silver band, embossed with a tiny T-bar brand. She had seen a cheroot just like it once before, in Caleb Thorn's hand, the day he had confronted her in the general store. It was his brand, as unique and arrogant as the man himself. Ilara picked it up, her fingers closing around it. She held in her hand the truth, the journal and the cheroot. It was everything. She looked up at the vast, empty sky, a silent, desperate prayer of thanks on her lips. She had the proof she needed. Now, all she had to do was ride back into the lion's den and use it before it was too late. Ilara rode back to Redemption Creek with the fury of a brewing storm at her back. The sky to the west had turned a bruised, greenish black, and the wind had picked up, whipping dust into devils that danced across the parched plains. The air was thick with the electric tension of a world holding its breath, a perfect mirror for the storm of truth she carried within her. The prospector's journal was wrapped in an oilcloth and tucked deep in her saddlebag. The silver-banded cheroot was a hard, damning lump in her pocket. Fear was a cold companion on the ride, whispering of all the ways this could go wrong, of Thorn's power and the town's blind hatred. But beneath the fear was a foundation of pure, unshakable resolve. She was no longer the Calamity Girl, a passive victim of fate. She was Cale's wife, the mother of his child. and she was coming to claim her husband's life from the man who had stolen it. The storm broke just as she reached the edge of town, the first heavy drops of rain kicking up the smell of dust and dry earth. She did not ride to the sheriff's office. She knew Sheriff Beauregard was a puppet, and his strings were held by the man she intended to destroy. Justice in Redemption Creek did not live in a jailhouse. It held court in the smoky haze of the saloon. She slid off the weary mule, leaving it untethered, and walked toward the swinging doors, the rain plastering her thin dress to her body and washing the grime from her face, leaving behind a pale mask of grim purpose. She pushed through the doors, and the noise of the saloon, the tinny piano, the clink of glasses, the rumble of men's laughter, died in a sudden, staggered wave. Every eye turned to her. She stood there for a moment, a drenched and wild-looking apparition, her gaze sweeping the room until it found him. Caleb Thorne sat at a poker table in the center of the room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, surrounded by his cronies. He was in his element, confident and expansive, the king on his throne. A cruel, amused smile touched his lips as he saw her. "Well, look what the storm blew in," he drawled, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Come to beg for your man's life? I'm afraid it is too late. The circuit judge arrives on the morning coach. Justice in this town is about to be swift and clean." Ilara did not answer him with words. She walked forward, her boots making soft, wet sounds on the sawdust-strewn floor. The men parted before her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and hostile curiosity. She stopped at his table, the rain dripping from the ends of her hair onto the green felt. She looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze as cold and hard as river stone. Then, with a deliberate movement, she pulled the oilcloth-wrapped journal from her bag and threw it onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud, scattering a stack of poker chips. Beside it, she placed the small, dark cheroot with its distinctive silver band. "Justice is indeed coming to Redemption Creek, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice not loud, but clear and steady, ringing with a conviction that cut through the thick air of the saloon. "But it is not for my husband." Thorne's smile faltered, a flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes. He looked at the items on the table, a slight frown creasing his brow. "This is the journal of Jedediah Morse," Ilara announced, her voice gaining strength, her words addressed not just to Thorne, but to every man in that room. "I am sure most of you knew him as a loud, angry man who argued with my husband over the price of a tool repair. That is the story Mr. Thorne wanted you to know." She pointed a trembling but steady finger at the journal. "But in here, he tells another story. He writes of a secret gold claim he found in the hills, a vein so rich it would have made him a wealthy man. He also writes of how Mr. Thorne found out about his discovery and tried to buy the claim for a pittance. He writes of how, when he refused, Mr. Thorne threatened him, telling him that the land has a way of swallowing men who do not know their place." A stunned silence had fallen over the saloon. The men were no longer looking at her with contempt, but with a dawning, horrified understanding. Their simple story of a savage blacksmith was crumbling before their eyes, being replaced by a much darker and more complicated one. "You all saw a public argument and believed it was a motive for murder," Ilara continued, her voice resonating with the force of the truth. "But what you did not see was Thorne's greed. He wanted that gold, and Jedediah Morse was in his way." Her gaze locked on Thorne, whose face had gone pale, his arrogance beginning to crumble. "You used my husband. You used his Pawnee blood, and you used your own whispers and influence to play on the fears you have nurtured in this town for years. You turned prejudice into a weapon to cover your own crime." She then picked up the cheroot, holding it up for all to see. "This was found at Morse's hidden camp, not far from his journal. I believe many of you know who smokes this particular brand, who has his own initial branded in silver on every single one." Every eye in the room swiveled from the cheroot in her hand to Caleb Thorne. The truth was suddenly, shockingly, undeniably real. It was laid bare on the poker table. Thorne's greed, his motive, his presence at the scene of the crime. For a moment, Thorne was frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. His entire world, built on a foundation of power and fear, was collapsing around him. The gentleman rancher vanished, stripped away to reveal the violent, cornered animal beneath. With a roar of pure rage, he kicked his chair back and lunged across the table, his hands outstretched like claws, aimed for Ilara's throat, but he never reached her. In that instant, two men moved. One was Peters, the rancher who had refused Cale's work. The other was a quiet farmer from the back of the room. Their faces were etched with a deep and sudden shame. They grabbed Thorne's arms, restraining him, their own strength born of a horrified realization of how easily they had been manipulated, how close they had come to sending an innocent man to the gallows. Thorne struggled, his face purple with rage, spitting curses. "Get your hands off me! She is a liar, a lying, cursed witch!" But his raving only sealed his guilt. Sheriff Beauregard, who had been watching from the doorway with a slack-jawed expression, saw the tide of power shift in the room. His loyalty, always to the strongest force, swung decisively. He drew his pistol, his hand shaking slightly. "Caleb Thorne," he said, his voice a reedy imitation of authority. "You are under arrest for the murder of Jedediah Morse." Cale was released into the gray, rain-washed light of the late afternoon. The door of his cell creaked open, and he stepped out, blinking, his face pale from his days in the darkness, his wrists raw from the ropes. He saw Ilara waiting for him at the end of the street, standing alone. The townspeople, who had been a hateful mob just hours before, now watched from their windows and doorways, their faces averted in shame, unable to meet his eyes or hers. Their reunion was not triumphant. There was no joyful rush, no victorious embrace. It was a slow, quiet walk toward each other through the mud of the street. When they finally met, they simply stood for a long moment, looking at each other, their eyes speaking of the horror they had both endured. Then he reached for her, and she fell into his arms, burying her face in his chest. He held her, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his head bowed over hers. It was not a hug of celebration, but of profound, aching relief. It was the embrace of two shipwrecked survivors who had found each other on a desolate shore, the weight of the storm and the sea still heavy in their bones. Justice had been served, but the scars, deep and invisible, remained. They knew, without having to speak of it, that they could not stay. Redemption Creek would never be their home. The open hatred might have been replaced by a grudging, shamed respect. But the memory of what had happened was now part of the very soil of the town. They would forever be the blacksmith who was almost hanged and the woman who had saved him. They would be a living reminder of the town's ugly secret, of its capacity for blindness and cruelty. Their presence would be a constant judgment, and they would never find peace there. They sold the smithy and its contents to a traveling merchant for a fraction of its worth. They did not care about the price. They packed their few possessions, a change of clothes, a handful of tools, the prospector's journal which the circuit judge had returned to Ilara, and the small bag of gold from his claim which she was granted as a reward. Into a sturdy wagon they bought with the money. They were leaving with more than they had arrived with, but they had paid for it with a currency of pain and fear. The final scene of their life in Redemption Creek was a quiet one. The wagon stood loaded, the mule hitched and waiting patiently. Cale helped Ilara up onto the hard wooden seat, his touch gentle. He climbed up beside her and took the reins in his hands. He did not look back. They rode west, away from the town, toward an unknown future. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean and the sky a soft, hopeful blue. The landscape ahead was still vast, still challenging, a rolling sea of plains and distant, hazy mountains, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a promise, a blank page on which they could write a new story. Ilara rested a hand on the gentle swell of her belly, where their child grew, a secret promise of their own. Cale saw the movement, and he reached over. Taking her other hand in his grip was warm and solid, an anchor in the vastness. They did not speak. There were no words for the journey they had taken, and none for the one that was to come. They simply looked forward, their faces turned toward the setting sun, etched with the memory of all the pain they had endured, but also with a resilient, hard-won hope that shone brighter than any fire. Their love, forged in prejudice and tempered by tragedy, had been tested to its absolute limit. It had survived. It had become its own form of justice in a lawless land, their ultimate weapon, their only true home, their one and final redemption. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel to share your thoughts in English.